before Dr. Clark comes up to speak. So our next speaker is Reverend Dr. R. Scott Clark. He is professor of church history and historical theology at Westminster Seminary, California, where he has taught since 1997. Dr. Clark received his bachelor's degree from the University of Nebraska, his Master of Divinity degree from Westminster Seminary, California, and his D.Phil from Oxford University. He is a minister in the United Reformed Churches in North America and has served in Reformed congregations in Missouri and California. He is the author of Recovering the Reformed Confession, Caspar Olivian and the Substance of the Covenant. He is editor of the Classic Reformed Theology series, and he has been editor of and contributed to many other volumes and periodicals and journals. Dr. Clark and his wife reside in Escondido, California, and have 2 grown daughters. Dr. Clark's lecture will consider the years 1000 to 1500 AD and is titled, What Happened? The Glass Ceiling Cracked. Please welcome Dr. Clark.
Well, good evening. Thank you for having me here. I bring you greetings from your brothers and sisters at the seminary and from Escondido United Reformed Church. It's great to see so many familiar faces. How come you didn't come down to Escondido? Why did I have to come up here? No, it's beautiful up here. Just turns out more complicated to get here than we thought. No, evidently they've never had snow in Seattle, and I don't know. Yeah, if you don't believe in purgatory, and we don't, but if I did, I would think that the airport today would have been a really good illustration of purgatory. I was so thankful to get out of there. I thought that I'm sure I was burning off sins, paying for incomplete penances just while I was there. Gnashing of teeth and wailing. So, missed flights, harried flight attendants, and whatnot. Well, the question before us this evening is, as we think about the 500 years leading up to Luther, how is it that one corpulent, or at least eventually corpulent, he wasn't always corpulent, I guess, so Augustinian Saxon monk turned the entire Western world on its ear? It's a remarkable thing if you think about that. After all, Luther was not one of the great theologians, at least when he was in university, as far as anyone knew. He didn't go to any of the great universities. The great universities when Luther was a boy were Oxford, Paris, then in the 14th century Cologne was founded and Heidelberg was founded, right? So those are the Yale and Harvard and the Oxford and the Cambridge, right? Those are those kinds of schools in that period. He basically went to one of these directional schools. Northeast Middle Normal Teachers College in Murfreesboro, Arkansas. That if we're heading on to the school in the United States, that's basically where we would have found him. And if you go to Wittenberg today, even, it's still a backwater. I mean, it's still not a particularly glorious place to be. When I was there in 2000, it was not too long after the Cold War, and it was still, everything was very dirty. You could tell when you crossed over from the West Germany into East Germany, it was just filthy, because evidently where I was raised by pious, sort of around in the midst of pious Methodists, and cleanliness was said to be next to godliness, and those godless communists made a mess of everything in East Germany. So how is it that this fellow from a backwater who went to school in an obscure university turned the whole Western world on its head? And he really did turn the Western world on its head. We just finished celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, or at least the one stage in the Reformation. And he's arguably one of the most important figures on anybody's, say, top 5 list for the last millennium, right? Even NPR tweeted out about Martin Luther. Somebody tweeted out the 95 Theses, right? If you Twitter, if you know what that is, it's perfect medium. Twitter's a perfect medium for tweeting out the 95 Theses, because the theses are short, pithy statements, and they fit on Twitter. And lo and behold, somebody sent it to me, and lo and behold, they tweeted out, and then they sent out a message saying we think we've been hacked. Somebody hacked our account, was tweeting out the 95 Theses, and then somebody said, no, actually the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. So when NPR is paying attention to Martin Luther, right, that's extraordinary, because he wouldn't ordinarily make their radar unless they were going to say something about World War II and anti-Semitism or that sort of thing you might expect. So how did an obscure German monk overturn the status quo that by the time he did it had been essentially fixed for 1,000 years? My students have a difficult time understanding what it means to live in a fixed world, and I keep explaining to them that, I was born in a really fundamentally different world. When I was growing up, Gunsmoke was on TV, and before that it had been on radio, and things didn't change. Gas was 35 cents a gallon, and it went up to 37, and then there'd be a competition, it dropped down to 19 cents. I mean, the world in which I was born was much more like the world in which in some ways, my grandparents were born. The world into which my students have been born is a world that is in flux, chaos, transition, and change is absolutely normal for them. It's terrifying for those of us over, I guess, 40. I wish it would stop. Leave us alone. Quit sending me email, and quit making me get a new phone every 2 years or whatever it is I'm supposed to do to keep up. And quit messing around with the phone that I have. I'm convinced it's 22-year-old boys are just too bored out of their minds, and they keep fiddling with, let's do this. No, I just figured it out. Leave it alone. So we live in this late modern, I'm terrified. The batteries are going out on our remote. and I can't. It doesn't work half the time, but I'm scared to get the next remote because I can't. If I ask Emily to make it work for me, she'll lecture me. Dad, you have to learn how to do this. Anyway, I don't want that lecture, so I just keep pushing the buttons. So we live in this world of flux and change and chaos, and people write long books about it. We live in a world in which nothing means anything. My students come with the assumption that there's no relationship between the words we use and the truth that we mean to communicate. That a person who claims to be telling the truth and insisting that there is such a thing as fixed truth, that person is essentially trying to pull a trick on you, essentially attempting to influence you in some way for some political gain. They're deeply suspicious of truth claims. The world into which Martin Luther was born was a completely different world. He was born into a world in which everybody knew what the truth was. God is truth, and God has revealed his truth through the Holy Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. There's no question about really what the truth is or where the truth is. The only question is, are you going to be able to cooperate with grace sufficiently to find yourself one day before God and survive the encounter? Nobody really is raising any question about that. And so the first part of we can divide these 500 years kind of in half. And the first half of this 500-year period, that's the world that we're talking about, a world in which the truth is fixed, God is in his heaven, the Pope is on his throne, the truth is mediated to the world through the church, and everybody knows what it is. And as I say, some of you are old enough to kind of remember that world when things didn't change very much, and what your grandfather knew to be true and what his grandfather knew to be true was what you know to be true, or at least knew to be true. And we've undergone a radical social convulsion that's probably a little bit overdue. They tend to happen in 40-year cycles. You can go back at least to 1920. The 20s we had one, 60s we had one. We probably should have had one right after 2000, but we had 9/11 instead, so I think that sort of slowed it down. But we're in the process of a similar kind of social convulsion. Well, we live in a completely different world than the world into which Martin Luther was born. There were two great questions that really convulsed the Western intellect between 1000 and 1500, and they had to do with the relationship between names and things. And I forgot to bring, I had coins. Oh, I have one. Oh, good. I almost never have coins, but I was in the airport, so that's a good place to get coins. So here I have in my hand a penny, and my students always say, "What's that?" They don't handle coins. And again, I'm old enough to remember, and Bob's certainly old enough to remember when pennies actually were copper, actually made. I don't know what they're made of now, but not much. But if I hand, let's imagine this was worth something. If I hand this to a clerk, we'll say for a piece of gum, why does the clerk give me a piece of gum in exchange for this coin? Have you ever thought about that? Especially since 1972, 73, when President Nixon took us off the gold standard, finally ended the relationship between money and gold. Now, and it's even more bizarre, we hand a clerk a piece of plastic, right? There was a time when we used to buy things with things that were worth something intrinsically. If you wanted to get something, you traded something of value. So you literally would take a chicken, which is something of value, because if nothing else, you can kill the chicken and eat it. So that has intrinsic value, right? You trade that for something else. I'll give you 2 chickens, all right, for that thing over there. I need a candle. I'll trade you a chicken for a candle, right? Now we trade a piece of plastic, right? Which is, now think about that. That's bizarre, really. I give a piece of plastic to a woman, and she runs it through a machine, and then she gives me something in exchange for a piece of plastic on the premise that it reflects something that's in a bank account that I never actually saw because my employer sent some numbers. Yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about it. But it used to be the case that the money we had, right, we used to trade things of value, so we traded chickens or whatever, or horses or or cattle for other things of value. And then we started exchanging money for things, but the money had intrinsic value. And it was that way for a very long time, until really, historically, last week, the money that we traded had intrinsic value. We actually traded pieces of gold. I don't know exactly why gold is of value, but it is of value. People, right, will do a lot to get gold. They'll rob you, they'll kill you, or lie to you, or steal. They want your gold. They value it. So we used to trade stuff of intrinsic value. And so the philosophers in the period used to ask this question: what makes a coin, particularly now? And I guess the penny here is a good example, because it is probably intrinsically worthless, right? If we were to dissolve this penny into its component parts, break it down, how much would it be worth? It wouldn't be worth a penny. It's kind of odd, right? But the clerk accepts it as if it were worth a penny. Why does the clerk accept it as if it were worth a penny? Or if I give her a quarter or give him a dollar? Well, because the government says it's worth $1. And then again, that will make your brain hurt if you think, why does that work? Right? How is the government able to say? Well, actually, this is an ancient question that goes back to this period. And is a lead coin what a lead coin is worth intrinsically, or is it worth what the king says it's worth? And philosophers and theologians argued about that. And what they were really arguing about is the relationship between names and things. And this is the great question of our age. What is the relationship between names and things, words and things? My students think there's no relationship. My students think that it's completely arbitrary. And there were people who came to argue that in this period. They said, so you have two schools of thought. One said that the relationship between words and things is built into the nature of things. It's baked in, as they say in politics. Things are the way they are, and they do what they do because God said so, because God is the way He is. Right? There's such a thing as nature, and it's all fixed, and it's all arranged, and it's not to be questioned. But people did come and question it. They questioned it, and they said, well, actually, we think things could be other than they are. We think things could be different than they are. And it was that questioning. That in some ways made the Reformation possible. Again, you have to ask yourself, how is it possible for an obscure Saxon monk to turn the entire Western world, the Western civil government, the Western church, Western society, completely on its ear? Something had to give. And what had come to happen, and this is why I gave this the title that I did, something had happened in the period from 500 to 1,000. So that by the time you get to about 1000 AD, there is this strongly held assumption in most places in the West that there's a kind of a glass ceiling over the world that God had established, and it can't be broken. You can't go, it's not natural for a human being to go any faster than a horse can go. How fast can a horse go? I don't know, let's say 35 miles an hour, for briefly. Probably wouldn't want to do that for very long. You're going to end up buying a new horse, I imagine. But the theory was that there is such a thing as nature. Now, we miscalculated as to what nature is, but those people couldn't imagine, or most of them couldn't imagine, that you could get, as I did today, get in an aluminum tube, rocket down a runway, lift off, and go to 40,000 feet or whatever we were at 400, 500 miles an hour. It's completely inconceivable. That would be demonic, contrary to nature. If you go 37 miles an hour, your head will explode because it's against nature. And so we lived in a world that was sort of controlled by a big glass ceiling. You couldn't see it, but it was there. And things are the way they are. They do what they do. You are the way you are. And the route to heaven is what it is because God is the way He is, and things couldn't be any other than they are. The route to heaven is what it is because God is the way He is. You are the way you are. There's this sort of calculus that they made, and it's fixed and it's unchangeable. Because you have to ask yourself, how is it that you're able to read the Bible and see that Paul says in Romans 3:28 that it's apart from the works of the law And you know exactly what that means, or that we're justified by his blood, or having therefore been justified. And you know perfectly well what that means. And yet they were reading the very same Bible that you were reading in different language, those that were reading it in Latin. But in Latin it says the same thing that it says in your English Bible most of the time. And particularly on this point, it says the same thing. Why didn't they see it? They didn't see it because they lived in this glass ceiling. Right? There's a movie like this. I can't remember which one it was. And there's a fellow who lives in a town that's completely artificial, and they've made a show out of his life. Truman Show. They made a show out of his life. He doesn't know that he lives in a TV show until he discovers that he is in a TV show, and that there's a world outside of this little artificial community in which he's been living. People began to question this accepted, received, fixed understanding of things, and it was this questioning. So I'm going to try and tell you the story briefly of how it came to be that we questioned this, and why people would question. Why people would question. Because we have to understand that somebody had to crack that ceiling. Somebody had to crack that glass dome, had to come up to it and tap it with a ball-peen hammer hard enough that it would crack, and people begin to realize, oh, there is a ceiling, and what's beyond that ceiling? What's outside there? Maybe things aren't what we thought they were. Maybe the Bible doesn't say what we always thought it said. Maybe the Bible doesn't say what we always thought it said. Right? Because that's how, right, something like that is how the Reformation happened. Because we really are asking, why did it take so long after the early Christian church, 2nd, 3rd centuries, 4th centuries, 5th century, why did it take so long from that period? Why did it take 1,000 years from Augustine until Luther for Luther to see these things? That is a remarkable thing to think about, that it took 1,000 years. And there's really no way to compress it. You could maybe cut out 300 years here or there, but you're still talking about 700 years. Right? It took a long time for us to figure this out. Well, one of the figures who helped to contribute to the glass ceiling, and these are great figures, important figures who taught valuable things. One of them was Anselm of Canterbury, we'll call him. He became Bishop of Canterbury in 1093. One of the most important theologians of the High Middle Ages, and that's the period that we're going to talk about, is the High and Late Middle Ages. Anselm of Canterbury actually is a very faithful teacher of the faith, very faithful preacher in many ways. He actually was very useful in the way that he talked about the relationship between faith and reason. So if you were expecting me to set up a series of bad guys, I'm sorry to disappoint you, because Anselm's not if we're going to talk about bad guys and good guys, he's not a bad guy, he's a good guy in many ways. He's a brilliant theologian, very thoughtful, very faithful, and for example, one of the things that he said is, I believe in order that I might understand. I believe in order that I might understand. And if you know anything about the history of the seminary where I teach, this is a really important principle. This is a principle that we learned from Professor Van Til, Case Van Til, Cornelius Van Til. He taught us that we start with the Word of God. We don't start with human reason. We start with the Word of God. The faith that we want to defend is the Christian faith. It's the biblical faith. We don't build a building over here, then sort of build a rope ladder and jump over to the Christian building at the last minute. The faith about which we want to talk, the faith that we want to defend is the Christian faith. It's the faith of the triune God. It's the faith of the sovereign God. It's the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ in salvation through faith in Him. And that's exactly what Anselm sought to do. He sought to explain the faith and explore the faith and defend the faith on the basis, first of all, that God's revelation comes first. Human reason doesn't come first. Now, he didn't always talk in a way that was consistent with that, or at least he talked in ways that has caused some confusion in some quarters. But if you read him carefully, he always comes back to these two principles. I believe in order that I may understand, but he does want to understand. And then he said, right, my faith is seeking understanding. Again, he starts with revelation. He starts with the Christian faith. My faith is seeking understanding. He wanted to explain the faith to his students. He wanted to explore the faith, and he wanted to defend the faith. So he started with God. He started with the Scriptures. He started with the Christian faith. He even proposed, and I won't dwell on this, but he proposed a way of defending the existence of God that I think still works. It's the technical name for it is the ontological argument. And my students often try to make it more complicated than it is. It isn't actually all that complicated. It simply says God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And all that means is, if you can think of something that isn't, that's not God. That's all that means. The philosophers have totally messed this up, and they're completely unreliable. You can read them for hours and hours and months and years, and you'll get completely lost and confused because they completely bollocks Anselm. He's just a preacher, he's just a theologian, he's not a philosopher, and it's not that complicated. If you can think of something that doesn't exist, that's not God. That's all he's saying. That's actually brilliant. What is God? He's whatever has to exist. He's the only thing that has to exist. And again, Professor Van Til, right, sits up and says, yes, that's what I was trying to tell you all those years ago, if only you'd listen to me. So you say, well, Clark, this isn't helping us get to understand how did Luther, if Anselm was so helpful and so good and so pious, why did we need Luther? Why were we so confused? Well, as good as Anselm was on things like faith and reason, and starting with Scripture and starting with God and not starting with human reason or human autonomy, he did make some significant mistakes. He inherited a system of salvation that taught that we're saved by grace. That sounds good, but not by grace alone. We're saved by grace and cooperation with grace. We're saved by grace and cooperation with grace. And the system that Anselm inherited and the system that he passed on is that God is favorable toward his elect, and he did teach that. By the way, and I'm sure Dr. Godfrey told you this, that we are not the ones who invented the doctrine of election. We didn't even invent the doctrine of reprobation. We're part of a great Western Christian tradition that has taught this for a very long time, even before Augustine, but certainly clearly and brilliantly taught by St. Augustine in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. So we are in that way very ecumenical Christians. And the fact that people think that John Calvin invented these things only testifies to the almost apparently irredeemable ignorance of the late modern world. Because anybody who knows anything about the history of theology knows that we're only repeating things that the great Christian tradition has taught for most of the last 2,000 years. You can find people in the very earliest Christian teaching in the 2nd century, as we do. That's what I'm reading this semester, is reading documents from the very earliest post-canonical Christian tradition. And repeatedly and unashamedly they teach that God elects, and then some of them even say that God reprobates. And they don't even explain it because it just seems obvious to them. Well, he's a recipient, Anselm is a recipient of all of this, but he knew that God says about sinners what he says because they are what they are. That God cannot say just of a sinner, right, or of a person until that person is actually inherently, intrinsically righteous. And so what in Anselm's world, right, we have to, when we look at a penny, we have to say, well, this isn't really, right, 1/100th of a dollar. He'd want to know exactly what this is made of, and that's what this is. It's nothing more than that, right? And in other words, he has a very strong relationship, an identity of the name and the thing. And God can only say about a thing what he says because it is what it is. God can only say what he says because a thing or a person is what it is. So in order for God to call you righteous or to call you saved or delivered, you have to be actually inherently, intrinsically righteous. And the question is, how do you get there? Well, the good news is God comes to you in his grace. The bad news is you have to do your part. The good news is God comes to you in his grace, and he, as Dr. Godfrey taught me many years ago, he set up the church as a kind of a service station, right? You put this is not Oregon, right? Washingtonians, you're allowed to put the thing in the tank. Oh, good. See, people in Washington are smart enough to fill their own cars. In Oregon, you got to sit and wait for somebody else to do it. Makes me nervous to sit in the car and wait for somebody. Anyway. I'm from working people. My grandpa was a farmer. I fill my own tank, but anyway, be that as it may. Right? Though the church is like a gas station, and we're being filled up on Sunday, and then through the week we sin and we burn off all this grace, and then we need to be refilled. And the church is just pumping out grace. And over this period of time that we're covering, right, the church is gradually adding sacraments. Gradually adding sacraments. Right? We started with 2, and the Western Church is sort of like, you men, right? If 2 is good, 7 is great. Right? And after all, 7 is a perfect number, right? So we basically elaborated on the 2 sacraments, and we took those elaborations that were very popular, by the way. One of the reasons why we say what we say about worship, in Heidelberg 96, in Belgic 7, right? 96, 97, 98, is because we knew the history of the church, and we knew that if you don't follow what God's word says, and you don't follow the proper rule, that popular practices, which is what those 5 false sacraments started out to be, they can turn into sacraments. So be careful what you do, because in 500 years from now, if you're right, it can be a sacrament, and I'm not kidding. Right? That's exactly what. It's nothing more complicated than that. And in the 13th century, the church ratified these 5 false sacraments. In the 13th century, right? Have you ever felt guilty that we don't have 7 sacraments? You feel like we're cheating, we're rebellious, we're disobedient. We not only went through and we took out books out of the Bible, right? You ever had that nagging doubt that there were books in the Bible and we took them out because we're rebellious? Nonsense, right? The early church didn't receive those intertestamental books, deuterocanonical books, the Apocrypha. Right? Those books were in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. They were added in the intertestamental period, and they were not received by the early church, and they didn't become received until the 6th or 7th centuries. We're not rejecting anything, right, that's actually true or right. We're following, somebody gives you a hard time, you just say, we're following Athanasius and Jerome. And we're not making anything up. So, the church added sacraments, and they set up a system whereby if you just did what they told you, and you did your part, and you cooperated, eventually, after purgatory, you would make it to heaven. And Anselm helped to contribute to this system. Anselm was deeply influenced by a philosopher, and that philosopher's name is Plato. He lived several centuries before Christ, and Anselm sort of unintentionally imbibed of some of those ideas, and he knew that there is a kind of nature of things to which maybe God isn't obligated, but we certainly are, and he helped to contribute to this glass ceiling that came to be built over the church and over the Western world. And another fellow we can look at is Bernard of Clairvaux, who died in 1153. Bernard's a very pious man. He was the favorite medieval theologian of Luther and Calvin. He was a critic of some heterodox theologians in his time. He preached the Second Crusade, defended the legitimacy of the Pope as Peter's heir, unsheathing the sword and unleashing it on the Turk, as they said. He's also a moral and ecclesiastical reformer. Opposed the rise of Gothic cathedrals because he saw the program as a tribute to the wealth and ambition of the aristocrats who built them, and not really about true Christian piety. He was a defender of the Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity, and it needed defending during his life. But he also wrote a very famous book, and actually a very good book in some ways, on grace and free choice. About 1128 is when he published that. And in this book on grace and free choice, he argued that something like this. He starts off talking about grace and how wonderful grace is. And when you first read the opening lines of the book, you think, this is marvelous. This fellow sounds like Luther and Calvin. And he does until it's kind of a dialogue, and one of the dialogue partners in the book says, well, if it's all of grace, where does our merit come? And Bernard, instead of saying merit, what are you talking about merit? We have no merit. Bernard says, well, of course we have merit, and the merit comes in the exercise of our free choice in cooperation with grace. Merit comes in the exercise of our free choice in cooperation with grace. And the moment he said that, another bolt got turned on that glass ceiling over the Western world. We're increasingly locked into a city, in a sense of our own making. Grace is like gasoline that facilitates, but you've got to press the gas pedal to make it go. You have to do your part. And what does that say by implication about your ability? If you have to do your part, it must be the case that you can do your part. And if you can do your part, then how sinful are you, really? Well, Augustine had said, like the Apostle Paul, that we're dead in sins and trespasses, and God has to sovereignly come and raise us from death to life. And in a sense, the Western Church agreed with that. But she said God comes and does that in our baptism. And baptism does what it does because it is what it is. What is it? Well, it's a kind of magic almost. Baptism does what it does because it is what it is, and it's a kind of magic. The moment it's applied to you, things necessarily happen. And not just the putting of the name of Christ on you or the putting of the triune name of God on you, but your spiritual condition is changed. You're not just initiated into the visible covenant community and separated from the world, but you are spiritually made alive. And now you must cooperate with that. And you must accumulate merit. And a merit of a particular kind. Merit that was considered worthy merit. It's called condign merit, or merit of condignity. You know dignity, so condignity. Merit of intrinsic worth. You have to, and you can. God has set up a system, according to Bernard and others, that says that you can set up, that says that you can do what you're expected to do in cooperation with grace, and eventually find yourself before God. Our salvation is by sanctification, and our sanctification is by grace and cooperation with grace. You are as saved and righteous before God as you are sanctified. So now we're back to the gas analogy. Right? So your spiritual life is like a gas gauge. You could measure it like a gas gauge. Right? Half full, 3/4 full, quarter full. Right? It's that very realistic way of thinking. God says what he says because he is what he is. He says about you what he says because you are what you are, and you are what you are by grace and cooperation with grace. And by the accumulation of merit. You're starting to feel the weight of this glass ceiling. It's sort of closing in on us. And then in the 13th century, maybe the greatest theologian, one of the greatest theologians of the medieval period, was Thomas Aquinas, who faced a series of challenges, two great challenges, one of which was a challenge from some radicals known as the Albigenses. We don't have time to get into it in any great detail, but in some ways, they were like the ancient heretics that we faced in the 2nd century. They were like the Gnostics. They divided the material world from the spiritual world. And they said the spiritual world is good and the material world is intrinsically evil. We need to get away from the material world. We need to overcome it. And they said a number of other radical things, and he had to respond to that. In the 13th century, when people said heretics, they were talking about the Albigenses. The other great question that he faced was this: does Aristotle's philosophies support Christianity or not? And if it didn't, is Christianity still plausible? There was a great Muslim scholar before Thomas who said, if you read Aristotle on his own terms, you can't reconcile him with Christianity at all. He doesn't think about the world the way Christians do, and he doesn't agree with Christianity. And Aristotle had come to have such cultural importance that Thomas had to defend the legitimacy of the Christian use of Aristotle and the plausibility of the Christian faith. Thomas is for a scholar, is actually an unusually interesting guy in some ways. He was a Dominican monk. His uncle had been in the Benedictines, and being a Benedictine for Thomas's family was kind of a family business. And his brothers wanted him to be a Benedictine, but he wanted to be a Dominican. The Dominicans were famous for teaching, and he was more interested in being a Dominican. They tried to get him disqualified from the Dominicans by sending a girl up to his room. And he didn't, the story is Thomas he didn't give in. He chased her out of his room. He got down on his knees and prayed and never suffered from temptation again. I'm not sure I believe that story, but that's the story. His teacher, Albert the Great, called him the silent ox. And when his fellow students mocked him, Albert said, the bellowing of this ox will be heard throughout the entire world. Thomas was a man, something like Dr. Horton or Dr. Fesco on our faculty. He produced a great number of works in a fairly short period of time. He was said to be able to dictate multiple books simultaneously. So he'd have a secretary over here, right? A clerk over here, and a clerk over here, and a clerk over here, and he would dictate for a while to this one, and he would dictate for a while to this one, and he would dictate for a while to that one. Then he would start over, and he was said to be able to pump out books that way. He died in 1274 in the Cistercian Abbey of Fossa Nova. Right? And some of you will get this joke. I can tell it here. I can't tell it to my students anymore because they don't get it. He died in the Fossa Nova, but you can't blame it on the Fossa Nova. Thank you for that. The Cistercians in the abbey where he died were so devoted to keeping him, they dug up his remains and moved him around because the Dominicans kept coming to look for him. And he died in 1274, and it took until 1369 for the Dominicans to finally figure out where his remains were and to get him and take him back to where he belonged. Well, Thomas is, as I say, one of the great theologians of the High Middle Ages, and he was also, in a sense, the prince of this realistic idea that I've been talking about, that God does what he does because he is what he is. For Thomas, this is the best of all possible worlds. If God could have made a better world, he would have made a better world. He also believed, however, that the world is, by virtue of just being the world, and this is really important, the world, by virtue of being created, is inherently broken. That's not what we had originally taught. It's not what Scripture teaches. Scripture says that God made the world and he called it good. There's nothing inherently wrong with the world as it was made, right? And that's what our Heidelberg Catechism said. Did God create the world, right? Did God make let's see, I lost it. I almost had it. Now Bob's going to make fun of me. Did God create the world, what is it? Wicked and perverse? No, God created the world in righteousness and true holiness. Right? He created us in righteousness and true holiness that we might rightly know God our Creator, heartily love him, and live with him in eternal blessedness. You can blame it on the air travel. Right? So we don't agree with Thomas on that. But that idea was deeply influential, that this is the best of all possible worlds, but just by virtue of being created, it's inherently broken, intrinsically broken, and we're all created with a kind of lust, an inherent lust. And God gives us a grace, even before the fall, to kind of suppress this lust, and by virtue of the fall, we lost that grace, and that's why sometimes people talk about a fall from grace. He also thought that the fall hasn't affected our intellect very much. Now, just to balance the story, at the same time, while he was teaching these things that begin to chip away in certain ways at the Christian faith, he's also a very strong teacher of the very same doctrine that Augustine taught of unconditional eternal election and reprobation from all eternity on the basis of foreseen corruption. But he agreed with Anselm and he agreed with Bernard that salvation is by grace and cooperation with grace. This is the system that God has set up. And grace is favor, but it's also God's action, he said, in leading us to union with him. Ultimately, for Thomas, because nature is what it is and grace is what it is, salvation is, and this is his language, deification. We need to overcome our creaturehood, ultimately, finally, in order to be saved. And again, you see the influence of that pre-Christian philosopher Plato. And again, a lot of people who write about Thomas miss that. They write about him as if he were only influenced by Aristotle, and he certainly was, but he was also deeply influenced by Plato, and that gets missed a lot. And for Thomas, salvation works like this. God actively comes and regenerates those whom he has elected and sets up a system where they must freely cooperate with grace. They must exercise their free choice and thereby create within themselves a kind of disposition to righteousness. Salvation is a matter of having the right disposition and the accumulation of righteousness and the accumulation of merit and the accumulation of sanctity, so that, again, God can only say what he says because you are what you are. So you see now, as we come to the end of the 13th century, the glass ceiling is pretty firmly bolted down on all sides. And the first guy to really seriously raise questions and to begin chipping away at this glass ceiling is a fellow named William of Ockham. William of Ockham died in 1347. He's an Englishman. He's something of a radical. Where Thomas was all about, philosophically, what the philosophers like to talk about, universals. Right? Thomas is about those things that sort of tie things together. Occam is a guy that we would understand very much in our time. He's always interested in what separates or what distinguishes things. Right? If you talk to a young person today and you say, well, this is like that, they'll give you 6 reasons why that's not true, because they've been trained to distinguish everything into particulars, and they've been doing this in the universities in the English-speaking universities since the early 1980s. It's called deconstructionism. It's what we do in university now. We deconstruct things. Right? You and I were raised in a world, most of you anyway, were raised in a world where we looked at things very differently. We received certain things as true. We didn't question them. And since the early 1980s, the universities have been devoted to questioning all of those things in such a way as to deconstruct them. Well, William of Ockham, we could say, is the first deconstructionist. He began to question this received world, right? That God says what he says because he is what he is. No, he said, God doesn't say what he says because he is what he is. You've put God in a box. Have you ever heard that expression, you put God in a box? Occam is one of the first people basically to make that charge against the Western tradition. You've put God in a box. God is free. How free is he? He is so free that God the Son could have saved us by becoming incarnate as a donkey. He actually said that. It almost made people's heads explode. John Calvin hated that particular sentence. He hated that with a passion. I think sometimes it would just come up randomly in his right. He would think about Occam and he would make a comment about how much he hated that. He also is one of the first people to attack the Pope openly and publicly. He called Pope John the 22nd Antichrist because he wasn't keeping his monastic vows. He'd taken a monastic vow of poverty. Have you ever noticed how, I'll give you an analogy, have you ever noticed how senators, when they're elected, there haven't been that many, but when senators are senators, they want the president to restrain his authority, and they want the president to respect the legislative body. But when the senator becomes president, right, everything changes. And when John the 22nd became Pope, he said, I'm going to keep my vow of poverty figuratively, spiritually, while 6 or 7 people carry me around on a chair, and I live in a very nice place and eat very nice food. Thank you very much. And Occam accused him of basically apostasy. He got in a lot of trouble for that. He stole the seal, not the or seal, but the thing that, I think that would have been a lot of fun. What are you doing with that seal? Well, it's the Franciscan seal. We're taking him to Germany. stole the seal of the Franciscans, went to Germany and drank beer and wrote nasty things about the Pope. And there he died. But in his theology, he raised questions about the way Thomas was using Aristotle. He raised implicitly questions about the influence that Plato had on Western theology. And he said, in fact, the relationship between names and things isn't what Anselm had said or what Bernard had said or what Thomas had said. We call things what we call them because we do, but we could call them other than we do. We call, right, a stop sign. Why are stop signs red? I don't know. But they are. But theoretically, stop signs could be green. Green could mean stop and red could mean go. It could. It's not like it's baked into the nature of things for stop signs to be red. I mean, he had a legitimate point in some ways. He said this is not the best of all possible worlds. Things could be other than they are. God is so free and so sovereign, he could have arranged things in a completely different way, and we don't know near as much about the way things ought to be or must be or have to be as we think we do. And so he said, as it turns out, we're not all that sinful. Oops, that was problematic. Said the sacraments don't do what they do because they are what they are. They do what they do because God said so, but he could have said differently. And he said, by nature, you have everything you need to be saved. You just have to make use of what you've been given by nature. He's one of the first people to say, in effect, God helps those who help themselves. What he said is God is prepared to co-act with people with those who make use of the antecedentia, he said, those natural powers with which they've been endowed. Basically, he turned grace into nature. Where Thomas had a very strong distinction between nature and grace, and where I think it's important for us to distinguish, maybe not the way Thomas did, Occam said there's really no distinction between nature and grace. Nature is grace. And one of his followers, Gabriel Biel, actually formulated a kind of covenant theology. And he said God had made a covenant, this is in the 15th century, God had made a covenant. And the covenant is this: to those who do what lies within them, God denies not favor. To those who do what lies within them, God denies not favor. That was the theology that Martin Luther was taught when he was in university. That was the theology that Martin Luther was taught when he was in university. He was taught this sort of, this is called nominalism. He was taught this nominalist philosophy, and he was taught this Franciscan theology when he was in university. And where Thomas and Bernard and implicitly Anselm had talked and thought about condign merit, Occam and Biel talked about a different kind of merit, congruent merit. Now, Thomas had too, but from a somewhat different point of view. They talked about congruent merit. They recognized that the achievement that we have before God is never really perfect, and so God has to impute perfection to our best efforts. This is important. The late medieval church, and even before that, but certainly by the time you get to the late medieval period, there were theologians talking about imputation. Who here believes in imputation? You all believe in imputation. The question isn't whether you believe in imputation, the question is, what is imputed? And what the Franciscans were saying at the end of the late medieval period is, God imputes perfection to your best efforts. That's the arrangement that he set up. God imputes perfection to your best efforts. That's the arrangement he set up. You're starting to get a feel for how it was possible for the Reformation to happen. I'm not saying that Luther, as a Protestant, agreed with all of this. I'm saying that Occam and Biel and others began to pound that ball-peen hammer on the glass, and it began to crack, and people began to question, and they began to think that there's another way. Now, this is what was happening in the university, but there are other things happening. I'll go through them quickly. There was a movement in the church coming into the late medieval period where people began to question what happens if a pope goes bad? If the pope is the head of the church, and if he is, in effect, the church, and if he goes bad, does the church go bad? It's called the problem of indefectibility. And they believe that the church could never really, truly defect. And how do you protect the indefectibility of the church? Because everybody believed that authority comes from God. The question is whether authority comes from God and goes through the council and from the council to a pope, or does it come from God and go through the pope to the council? And political theorists are having a parallel argument. Does authority come from God, of course, and does it go through the king to the parliament or through the parliament to the king? They were having these parallel arguments. And these conciliarists began to question the authority, in theory, of the papacy. And in 1302, the papacy responded by saying, no, I'm the pope, and anybody who disagrees with me is outside the church. And anybody who is outside the church is outside salvation or the forgiveness of sins. To reject papal authority places one outside the church and therefore outside of salvation. And further, God has given to Peter both the civil and the spiritual swords, and the magistrate, the king, works for the pope. In 1302, this decree was called, this papal bull for a bulla is a seal, it's a sealed declaration. Right? Think of hot wax and sealing it. This is probably the high point of papal authority, but it's also the beginning of the end. Even as the Pope issued this decree, unum sanctum, his authority, though he didn't know it and nobody else knew it, was already cracking, was already weakening. His plausibility was weakening, and it would only get weaker. In 1378, Roman cardinals elected Urban VI, and he was such an unpopular pope that the cardinals, when they emerged from the election, lied to the people in the street about whom they'd elected. Some cardinals decided to fix this, and so some of the very same papal electors, think of our American Electoral College, right? This is basically the same thing. Cardinals are the papal electoral college. So some of the papal electors moved to Avignon, and they elected there a pope, Robert of Geneva, as Clement VII. And now you have dueling popes, both elected by papal electors. It's as if the cardinal, or the electoral college would pick up and leave Washington, D.C. and go to God's country in Nebraska and elect a competing president. Right, the same sort of thing. And then it got worse. So you have now for decades competing popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome. I bet you didn't know that happened. It went on for a long time. And they were both duly elected. And if you ask a Roman historian, Roman Catholic historian, how do you know who was the pope and who was an anti-pope? They'll give you a technical answer. You ready for that? It's a very technical answer. It sounds like this: humana, humana, humana. That is the technical answer, because they have no answer. They can't explain, because it's just arbitrary. Basically, they picked the pope who was in Rome, because if they say it was the one who was in Avignon, that creates certain problems for them. And it only got worse. This thing continued, and each pope would excommunicate the followers of the other pope, so that pretty much by the end of the 14th century, every pope or every person in Europe was excommunicated. Well, this created a crisis, because eventually this filtered down even to the lowly stable boy and the people who mucked out the streets. And in 1409, a council in Pisa elected a third pope. Right? Who's the proper pope? Who's the vicar of Christ on the earth? They all had a legitimate claim to being the vicar of Christ. After all, it wasn't like Jesus had established a college of cardinals. That actually had a beginning in time and place in history. It was a convention. So now the papacy is in crisis. If you don't know who the pope is, maybe the whole thing needs to be reconsidered. Papal corruption also gave people a reason to doubt. And I'll draw this to a close here quickly. In Sixtus IV, which is always confusing and hard to say. In 1470, in the late 15th century, died in 1484, extended plenary indulgences to raise money. Plenary indulgences, and that was what the 95 Theses were about. An indulgence was a pass out of purgatory for the acts of contrition that you had not completed in this life. Innocent VIII, and people were suspicious of this, it looked like a money-raising scheme because it was a money-raising scheme. Innocent VIII fathered 16 illegitimate sons, and he only admitted 8. Priests and popes were meant to be celibate. Alexander VI, Rodrigo de Borgia, openly kept a mistress in the Vatican. He tried to make his son a cardinal and also tried to make him pope, but Rodrigo failed to become pope because he died of syphilis. The papacy was shockingly corrupt. He had a daughter, Lucretia, who was, at least by repute, a notorious poisoner. It was so, the papal bloodshed and the corruption and the immorality was so vicious that it shocked even the hardest political observers of the period. Julius II actually conducted Mass, right? Julius II is Pope just before the Reformation. He actually conducted Mass wearing papal armor. If you watch the Luther film that was made in the 90s, you see a fellow go by with a retinue of soldiers and he's wearing armor. That's Julius. Right? He's just coming back. Why is he at battle? He's at battle because he's fighting to extend the papal territories. He's just an Italian duchy collecting territory. People could see all this. You didn't have to be able to read to see that the church was deeply corrupt. Scholars found out in the 15th century that the claim the papacy made that Constantine the Great had given to Pope Sylvester secular authority over Europe was a forgery. So there were lots of reasons why people began to doubt the legitimacy of the existing order. And scholars gave intellectual reasons for doubting the existing order. Finally, the last thing I'll say is that it wasn't just the rise of the nominalists and Occam, right, and the Gabriel Biel and the Franciscans, whose doctrine of salvation was even worse than Thomas's, right? They took us back to Pelagius. Right at the end, there was a rise of people who were reading Augustine again, and they were recovering Augustine's doctrine of sin and Augustine's doctrine of free, unconditional, sovereign grace. Now, there's more to be done, and we'll talk about this tomorrow. But if we're trying to explain how is it possible for a monk, right, in Erfurt and Wittenberg to turn the world on its ear, it's possible because the glass ceiling that got constructed gradually from 1000 to about 1275 or 1300 came under serious assault in the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, or 3 centuries. And you combined those doubts with the moral corruption and the crisis of the papacy. And there were some other things. The Renaissance helped create the preconditions for the Reformation. As we come into the 16th century, the conditions are now ripe, and almost everybody recognized it, that the church was corrupt in head and members, and something had to be done. And there had been lots of attempts to reform the church morally, and they had all failed because something else had to be done. Doctrine had to be changed. The Christian life could only be renewed if the gospel was recovered and doctrine was purified. Thanks for your attention this evening.
Well, that ends our evening program. Tomorrow we're going to be starting at 8.